Your fake news. You know where you've heard that before, don't you? Yes, of course, it's the one and only Donald J. Trump at some of his rumbustious press conferences in the White House, accusing the media of not reporting the truth. And of course, it's something that's been used against him repeatedly over the years. And yet, funny thing, about 4 years on from Trump first saying it, some polling out today with the Reuters Institute says that you're beginning to think that as well. Remarkable figures. Only 28% of people in this country believe consistently what the news channels are telling them. And in particular, the BBC, trust in the BBC has fallen by 20% since 2018 alone. So there's never been a time when trust in what we see on the television, hear on the radio, read in the newspapers has ever been lower. Allied with that, trust in politicians too has fallen very, very heavily. And in many ways, I'm not in the least bit surprised by this, because just look at what's happened over the course of the last couple of weeks. Following the death of George Floyd, we've seen coverage in the United Kingdom that would make you think it had happened here, would make you think that we have very similar types of policing to the USA and very similar black-white divides to the USA. And yet, whenever I turn on the BBC, it could be Channel 4, it could be Sky, it doesn't matter. We are completely bombarded by a narrative that somehow we are awful, terrible, backward, knuckle-dragging, racist people, and we should be deeply ashamed, not just of who we are today, but everything we've ever stood for as a nation. That message, that narrative is coming out of mainstream media constantly, day on day on day. And anyone that dares to challenge this, anyone that says, whoa, a second, those three words, Black Lives Matter, that's fine. Of course we want to live in an equal and a fair society. But the organisation Black Lives Matters is an openly Marxist organisation that wants to bring about the end of capitalism, the end of the nation state operating on its current form, and of course wants to defund the police, indeed wants to abolish the police force. Now, I'm one of the few people that's been saying this over the last couple of weeks, and I'm accused of being a liar. Well, don't take it from me. Just go to the Black Lives Matter website. And the way the media have dealt with things, because they refuse to even countenance any proper debate about who Black Lives Matters are, but the way they behaved was even worse over the toppling of the statue in Bristol, the Edward Colston statue. Yes, he was a slave trader, but remind ourselves, the entire British establishment were slave traders, as were the rest of the European countries. Perhaps worth noting that the long campaign of Wilberforce then led to the Royal Navy spending nearly half a century trying to stop the slave trade in its entirety. But that point, I think, gets lost on many. The real issue is, it was the mob, an angry mob, that decided they would tear down this statue amidst screaming hysterics and throw it into the seaside dock. And to listen to so much on our mainstream media, they are basically condoning that kind of behaviour and trying to move the argument on to many other historical figures. Doesn't matter whether it's Francis Drake, whether it's Winston Churchill, and you realise that actually this is not about racial equality in our country. This is in fact cultural Marxism. It is an attempt to destroy everything this country has ever stood for. And there's been precious little resistance. It took Boris nearly 10 days to write a piece in the Telegraph condemning some of the behaviour. Although it was noticeable, he was much harder on the far right than he was on the far left. The man that's been arrested for urinating on Keith Palmer's memorial, well, I'm pleased, very pleased, that he has been arrested. but not a single arrest has been made for those that vandalised Winston Churchill's statue, those that desecrated the cenotaph. And that, frankly, isn't good enough. But those of us that have tried to speak out, have tried to have a proper debate about Black Lives Matter, have tried to argue that a mob toppling a statue, is something with horrible historical connotations. It is only those extreme regimes that allow this sort of behaviour. We've even seen one university that is going to decolonialise its library. I mean, they'll be burning books in the street next. And yet those of us on both sides of the pond that have dared to stand against it, think of Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, now 7 of the big Fox News advertisers have been so bombarded by Soros-funded organisations, they've removed advertising from his show. And you might say, well, Nigel, what have you got to say about the fact you're no longer on LBC? Well, I will say that I'm very disappointed. I will say I put my heart and soul into that for the last 3.5 years, but I'm not going to get into a row. That's unseemly. I'm just going to get on, move on with my life. But you might imagine that what is going on in this country is much the same as happening to Tucker Carlson. Advertisers are being bombarded with tens of thousands of emails from people who would probably never buy their products anyway. So the result of all of this is the gap between mainstream media and where ordinary folk in this country are has never, ever been wider. It will get filled. That gap will get filled. It'll be the online subscription model, I suspect. It'll be online by whatever means that closes it. And it needs to happen because free speech is under threat.